Hallo und willkommen. Das Thema dieser Rezension wird die Rollei 35 Belichtungsmesser sein. Hello and welcome. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the Rollei 35B. I would just like to say, if I mangled the German introduction, my apologies to my German-speaking audience and to Martina, who very kindly translated that for me, and I hope that was understandable. So to begin this review, we're going to have a potted history of the Rollei 35B and the Rollei 35 range of cameras. Now, at the time of production, the Rollei 35 was the most compact 35mm camera that was available. And it's literally just slightly larger than a 35mm film canister and a take-up spool on one side, so it's just as big as it needs to be and no bigger, with a retractable lens design making it nice and compact. The B model has the shutter speed dial around the ring, which means it doesn't fold up quite as compactly as the original 35 model, but it's still nice and pocketable. You'd slip that into a pocket and barely know it's there. The B designates a light meter, a selenium cell light meter, and stands for Belichtungsmesser, which is German, designating the light meter. There was a 35C model, which seemed to be quite rare. I have a 35, a 35B and a 35 LED, which was a later model incorporating LEDs within the viewfinder, indicating underexposure, overexposure and correct exposure. And the C model did not actually include a light meter, and it's something that I would like to actually complete my collection, but it's not something that you see very often. So I don't know if there were lesser numbers of those made, or they were perhaps just not as popular. So the lens used is a 3-element triatar lens, which some people will criticise because it's not as sharp as the tessar lens used on the 35 model, but it still produces excellent images, as you will see at the end of this review. And the camera itself is a light version of the Rollei 35, and if you handled just this and or an LED, you wouldn't really notice particularly, because they do feel very sturdy, very solidly made. But when you handle a Rollei 35 at the side of them, you can physically feel the difference. It's a heavier camera, it's a much more solid camera, and it actually feels better built, although that's not to detract from the B or LED models, because they are very solid cameras. And it doesn't mean that the 35 is so much better. It does have a slightly better lens, it does have a bigger range of shutter speeds, it's generally a more professional, if you like, version of this camera, but with this camera you will still get excellent photos and you'll still get excellent results. The B35 was introduced in 1969 with the designation B35. In 1976 the designation was changed to 35B, simply to be more in keeping with the Rollei range of camera products, but no physical changes were made to the camera. The camera is still essentially the same. This one is designated B35, so as you can tell is a slightly earlier model, but it is a made in Singapore model. Now originally these were German cameras, hence the introduction. However, production was moved to Singapore for many of the cameras, including the 35. And while a lot of people typically say in these scenarios, oh, you want to get yourself a German-made one, they're much better built, etc. And this applies to many products, not just the Rollei cameras. In the case of the Rollei cameras, I have used German-made ones, I've used Singapore-made ones, and honestly and truthfully cannot tell you of any difference between the two. They are all as excellently made as one another. They all produce excellent quality images. And the problem with the Rollei is the made in Germany or Singapore logo is on the back plate, which is easily removable and swapped with a back plate from another camera. So for everyone out there thinking they have a German made one, they could actually have a Singapore made one with a German back plate, and vice versa. So don't get yourself hung up on that if you're looking for one. Don't worry about whether it's German made or Singapore made. Don't worry if the B comes before or after the 35. That just designates the age of the camera rather than the quality of it, because they're all the same camera. Just go out there, get yourself one. The B and the LED models are very cheap, very easy to get hold of on eBay and such, and they are excellent little pocket cameras and give great results. We're now going to take a detailed look around the camera. Starting with the front, it's an all metal construction with a leatherette finish, and on the front we have the lens release button down here, and we have the lens itself, which is a 3-element triatar lens. On the lens we have a focusing ring from 3 feet to infinity, and if you look underneath you've got the same thing in meters, so 0.9 meters to infinity. So depending on your preferred measurement method, you've got an option there. The ring directly behind this, it has dots on designating the hyperfocal distances at f8 and f16, possibly f11, I'll have to double check on that one. The ring directly behind that is your aperture ring, which goes in half steps from f3.5 to f22. So its widest aperture is f3.5 and the narrowest at f22. Directly behind that is your shutter speed ring, which goes from bulb 30, 60, 125, 250 to 500. 1/500th of a second being the maximum shutter speed. Also on the front is the viewfinder window and the selenium cell light meter window, which is an uncoupled meter, meaning that you can't view it through the viewfinder, you have to view it independently, make your adjustments and then compose your shot through the viewfinder. It's worth mentioning that any camera with a selenium cell light meter will need to be checked for accuracy against a known and trusted light meter, ideally an independent one or one from a camera that you know is good, a digital camera for example. And it's well known that that cameras with selenium cell meters are over 10 years old, especially if they've been stored in the light, in a cabinet where light is hitting them all the time rather than in their storage bag and in the dark. The light meters can become inaccurate. Now, the good thing is if the meter still works but it's inaccurate, you can figure out how many stops inaccurate it is and then adjust mentally after you've taken a meter reading, so it doesn't become completely useless unless it stops working altogether. Next to that is the brand naming on the top plate, the Rollei B35 underneath. On the bottom of the camera we have the rewind lever, which flips out and has a direction arrow indicating which way you rewind your film. We have the tripod mount, which also is the release, which has 2 little knurled thumb grips which you twist to release the back plate to load film. You have a rewind button to disengage your drive cogs, which feed the film across to the take-up spool. So you press this and rewind this button. And then you have your hot shoe mount, which quirkily, like all of the Rollei 35 cameras, is mounted underneath, making flash photography a bit of an oddity because you either have to turn the camera upside down to get an above the subject flash, or you can take flash subjects with the flash below to get something a little unusual and odd. The side plates of the camera are simply plain and unexciting, with just a couple of screws to hold the plates in place, and also the quick release clip mount for the wrist lanyard, which just simply pops in and out on a spring clip like so. The back of the camera is similarly plain. You will have a designated made by Rollei Germany or made by Rollei Singapore on the bottom of the back plate, and then you've got the wind on lever sticking out here and the viewfinder window over here. And finally, on the top of the camera we have all the other relevant controls. So you have your film counter window here, which counts up to a total of 36 frames. You have your shutter release button here with a screw-in central mount for a cable release, a shutter cable release or bulb release. The top plate, which is actually missing a little plate just here, which designates the shutter speed that you set this little pointer to, but there are only 5. It's 30, 60, 125, 250, 500, starting at the front and working to the back. So what you would do Having set your film speed on this little wheel accordingly, you would then move this to the shutter speed that you wish to use, and then read where the needle points to an aperture setting up here and set your aperture accordingly. And then just over here you have the film winder, so release the shutter, one single sweep, and that will advance the film to the next frame and cock the shutter. It's very, very smooth in operation and very, very easy to use. Despite being on the left where your film advances usually on the right hand side, it does operate very quickly and smoothly with your left hand. You get used to that very, very quickly indeed, and it's a lovely smooth operation. Feeds your film through absolutely fantastically, as you can see. Now we'll take a look inside the camera at the film loading area. You release the back plate by twisting the base tripod mount knurled grips anti-clockwise, and then slide the back plate down the grooves and off. The film pressure plate flips out on a spring. Your film canister fits into here, feeds across here and into your film take-up spool. Putting the pressure plate back across, you would fire off a frame, wind on your take-up spool to make sure that it's drawing the film through with the cogs here. Once you're happy that that's in place, you would place the back on the camera, fire off a frame, advance another frame or maybe another couple of frames to pull the film through, so you've got fresh film in your exposure window here behind the lens, ready to fire away. The only remaining question now is, what is the Rollei 35B like in daily use? So, like any camera, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's a little bit different to your regular camera with a right hand thumb wind, for example. If you're more used to older cameras like the Zenit or any camera with an uncoupled selenium cell meter, then you'll get along with it very, very well. If you're used to match needle meters through the viewfinder, you'll find it very tricky. Also, because it's a point and shoot style camera, it's not a range finder, so you haven't got a patch finder to calculate your distance, and it's not a through the lens camera, so you cannot actually focus through the lens like you can with an SLR. So you need to bear this in mind as well. So it does take a little bit more thinking about, but once you've gotten a handle on that, it's actually very easy to use. So you load up with film, you set your ISO speed, and then using your selenium cell meter you can match the shutter speed that you select on the dial at the top from 1/30th to 1/500th of a second to the aperture that it will give you. And you don't have to move this once you've set it. I leave this set in the middle, and I know I've got 2 stops either side. So for example, I leave this set in the middle, which is 1/125th of a second. If this tells me I need to be shooting at f8 for 1/125th of a second, but I'm actually shooting at 1/60th because I've selected 1/60th of a second shutter speed, I can either flick this dial forward to tell me that I need to be at f11, or I can just mentally tell myself that I need to be at f11 because it's 1 stop difference. So it's quite straightforward. Once you've got the hang of it, you've literally got 5 stops of shutter speed or aperture control. So if you leave this set in the middle, you know pretty much where you're at all the time, as long as you've got your ISO set correctly. The last thing you need to do before using the camera is figure out whether you're setting a hyperfocal distance. So if you're shooting at, for example, f8, you can set the infinity mark to the hyperfocal distance pointer on the lens, which will give you a shooting range from just over 10 feet to infinity, which means that just over 10 feet to infinity will be in focus. Alternatively, you have to work on a kind of a guesstimation system and choose between your distances of 3 foot up to infinity according to where you're pointing the camera, and it goes 3 foot to 20 feet and then infinity from there on. So unless you're taking very, very close-up objects, it's surprisingly hard to get that wrong, I think you'll find. And certainly not as hard as most people think. The one thing you do need to be wary of when shooting with any of the Rollei cameras is, well, not so much the LED, because that actually has an LED in the viewfinder, so it adjusts as you're adjusting the controls. But it's with the B is to make sure that you're not moving this expecting this to change your shutter speed or aperture controls. You need to set the aperture manually on the lens with the aperture ring, and then you need to set the shutter speed manually on the lens with the shutter speed ring behind it. So that's something that a lot of people new to these cameras do. They adjust the setting up here, think that they've made the necessary adjustments, and then click away. So you do need to know that this wheel at the top is simply a guide. Once it's set to the shutter speed, once it's set to the ISO of the film, this then tells you which shutter speed matches which aperture, which you still then have to set manually on here. It sounds very complicated, it sounds a bit long-winded, but you'll find in practice that it's actually very quick to do. I tend to use black and white film shooting above box speed, so typically I'll shoot HP5 at 800 or 1600 depending on the day, and I will typically stick to f8, f11 and set a hyperfocal distance. I then take a measurement exposed for the shadows, set the shutter speed accordingly, and then from that point on it's within the ballpark, and you very, very rarely have to change it unless it suddenly clouds over, or if it's been cloudy it suddenly gets very bright, for example, or if you go from outdoors to indoors or something like that. But in the main it's actually very straightforward and very quick to use, very quick to take a quick reading. I need to click down or up an aperture or two, I need to just set the distance, and then frame and click, and away you go. So in use I find it very easy. It was a little awkward at first, the B35 being the first one of these cameras that I got, and I found it a little bit fiddly at first, and I did take, with my first roll I took quite a few shots before realising I hadn't actually set the focal distance, because I'm looking through the viewfinder thinking that's nice and clear, being used to using an SLR, snapping away, and then after I'd taken 3 shots or so, I then realised I'd just been leaving this set at about 20 feet. But I got some surprisingly usable images out of that. So yes, you do need to think a little bit more than a modern SLR where you point, it will focus for you and you snap away, or even an older SLR where you can see whether it's in or out of focus. But it is very, very usable indeed. The beauty of this, of course, is you collapse the lens, slip it into your pocket, you can barely notice it's there. Very small, very light, and a joy to use. Lovely quiet shutter with a very, very quiet snap when you press the shutter button. Quick smooth wind on, which you get used to with your left hand surprisingly quickly. So all in all, once you've gotten used to it, it is a little bit of a learning curve. When you first pick one up it might seem a little confusing. Once you've gotten used to it, it's an absolute doddle to use, and almost as quick as any sort of older manual thumb wind SLR camera. Once you remember that you either need to set your hyperfocal distance first, or you need to, as you're kind of eyeballing a scene that you think you're going to take a picture of, get into the habit of rolling the focus distance on with your finger underneath here on the knurled rim at the bottom. You're looking at a scene thinking, okay, that's about 10 feet away. You can quickly whip that round to about 10 feet. If you need to, make a quick aperture adjustment or a quick shutter speed adjustment, and then lift and snap. So surprisingly easy, surprisingly quick once you're used to it. What I'm going to do now is load the camera up with some film. We're going to go out and take some photographs, and then we'll show you a few sample images. We're going to load some film into the Rollei 35B. So opening up the back and moving the pressure plate out of the way. First of all, feed a little bit of our film leader into the take-up spool. Stretch that across and close it, and then holding the pressure with your thumb, making sure the shutter's fired the lens will have to be extended for this, like so. Wind on one full turn to make sure it takes up the film, as you can see there. Then taking the back plate, locate it into the grooves, slide it fully on and twist the lock underneath clockwise. Fire off a frame and advance 1 or possibly 2 frames.